Thank you, Ben. Really pleased to be here. It's my second collaborative and my second Classy Awards, and already had some great discussions and looking forward to more, but especially excited about a conversation with my old friend Kevin Bolduc. We've known each other for 10 years now. I think it makes us both feel a bit old. And we were just talking about how the nonprofit sector, the broader philanthropic community, really has evolved in some significant ways in the last 10 years. But we've still got a long way to go. So we'll talk today about data, about transparency. And Kevin, I just wanted to start out by saying, I think you're the only person that I know who has expensed a pair of underwear to a foundation.
That's true.
And I was wondering if you could just quickly tell that story and then what that says about the experiences that you've had at CEP and what that's taught you about the sector.
Sure, absolutely. Is this thing on? Yep, there we go. Absolutely. So the Center for Effective Philanthropy, where I'm vice president, really works with big philanthropic foundations and other kinds of funders to help them get the data and insight and advice that they need to make better decisions about how they spend their all too limited resources in addressing the major social challenges that we all know about and we all face every day. One of the things that we do at CEP is provide foundations with data from feedback from stakeholders, from grantees, from staff, from other kinds of stakeholders to help them get candid, unbiased, actionable feedback about how they can continue to improve their work over time. So early on, Hewlett Foundation, where Jacob was a program officer at the time, was one of the first foundations to use one of these tools. And I was there presenting results to the CEO, or the president at the time, Paul Brest, an early champion of strategy and data and philanthropy. And we had one meeting set up with the leadership to talk about this information. It was feedback from grantees, feedback from staff. The end of the day rolled around and we were still talking about it. And Paul just turned to me and said, we have a board meeting tomorrow. It strikes me that this is information that they might be interested in. Could you stay and talk a little bit with the board, instead of me talking with the board, about some of this information? And it was an interesting moment. I said, of course I will. I need to, the HR director then drove me to the nearest Macy's to buy some clothes for the next day, because I was planning on getting on a red-eye flight back to Boston, where I live. But it was an interesting moment in terms of transparency, because the initial response was, okay, we have this information, it's good for accountability, but who do I share it with? Who uses it? How does it get contextualized? Data without context is not that actionable. And so I was appreciative of Paul in that moment, looking around and saying, okay, I don't have all this context. CEP's done this work for a lot of foundations, or is doing this work for a lot of foundations. How can I share this with the right people in my organization, both higher, the governors of the organization, and lower, the program officers and other staff of the foundation, who will be the people that need to be my partners in taking action. And so even though that was just internal transparency, writ kind of small, it's fundamentally about the culture and practice of using data and information well within an organization. So that's my ante for this conversation. The story about how it works in an organization. We'll talk more about what I see more broadly in the funder-grantee relationship and community about transparency. But before we go there, I want to turn it over to Jacob, who I've always thought of as a much smarter theoretician than I am, and he is, and a bit of a data nerd. So Jacob, take it away. How does this connect from an organization to the bigger picture?
So back when I was a very pretentious college student, I took a number of courses in philosophy and political theory, and I enjoyed them very much, but I never really thought that they would be relevant on a day-to-day basis to a job where you got a salary. And it actually turns out that stuff I learned in classes on postmodern epistemology is relevant, every day for me at GuideStar. As we think about questions like, what is the nature of truth? And how do we look at facts and understand what meaning we can draw from those? It actually turns out are questions that we at GuideStar have to wrestle with every day as we think about how do we present data? How do we collect data? What do we imply that data is actually telling us? And what is it not telling us? How do we think about an ethical responsibility for how we present that data? And I'll just give one example of how that's really gone wrong in the nonprofit sector. Is that because of the financial data that's available about nonprofits through the IRS Form 990, there's been what some psychologists call availability bias, which is you're biased towards the data that's available. And so the financial data is available, for almost all nonprofits. It allows you to make a calculation like, for example, what's the overhead ratio of a nonprofit? And then to say, all right, well, that's all we got, so we're going to use that as our proxy for performance. We're going to say, well, the only data we have is this financial data, so we're going to use that to judge who is actually a good organization and who isn't. Anyone who's spent any time in the nonprofit sector knows just how wrong-headed that is, how counterproductive it is, how it starves nonprofits of the resources that they need. So embedded in how we choose to organize information are profound implications for how we make decisions for social change. And keep in mind that the nonprofit sector is $1 trillion a year. That's 12 zeros of the US economy. More than 1 million organizations, more than 12 million employees. An immense part of American society that has too often been driven, and resource allocation decisions have been made according to insufficient information. And so we've got to solve that problem. The other theoretical framework I will offer is just the social contract. Most of you probably remember learning about the social contract. It's this idea that individual citizens make a deal with the government. They say, look, we will give up some freedoms as long as you help to create a stable society in which I'm safe. And that's sort of a trade. And I believe there's now another social contract, which is between society and organizations, that basically says, hey, organizations, whether you're a for-profit company, a social enterprise, a nonprofit, whatever type of organization, we as society are going to give you a license to operate, sort of both legal and social permission to do your thing, on the condition that you engage in certain behaviors. Like you're actually useful to society. You create jobs or good products or social value. That you measure multiple bottom lines. You're not just, as a company, only looking at profit, but you're also thinking about the other impacts you're having. Or as a government agency, you're not just measuring economic impact, but you're also thinking about other aspects of society. Or as a nonprofit, you're not just measuring overhead, but you're measuring results. And then also, I think another part of this new social contract that all organizations are subject to is transparency, a willingness to share basic information about what you're trying to do, how you judge your own progress, how you're going to get there. And that's the bargain that allows us all to do our work. And so our challenge as a field is to figure out, well, how do we fit into that bargain? And how do we make that bargain work as well as possible?
And so you turn to this question, I think, of like, well, what is transparency? What does it really mean? And I think that's going to drive a bunch of what Jacob and I will talk about over the next few minutes. And that's where CEP has done some research on this particular topic. And in particular, with our focus at CEP on the funder community, what do funders look at in terms of transparency? What do they mean by it? And what do nonprofits mean? Where are the definitions the same and where are they different? And so this is a big question that we decided we would ask. We asked hundreds of CEOs of major foundations and thousands of nonprofits what they thought about transparency. And what was interesting is that the definitions they offered were almost identical. So that's a good sign. They thought about transparency as clarity, openness, and honesty, period. And I think you can see how that fits in with some of what Jacob was saying in terms of the social contract about how do you need to be clear, open, and honest in order to reinvigorate and reinforce the license you have to do work in the nonprofit sector that should be benefiting all of us in one way or another. And so then we move from what's the definition of transparency to this question of, well, what needs to be made transparent? What kind of data and information is most important? And there were some similarities and some differences. So what was different? Well, nonprofits, as it turns out, at least in terms of what they were looking for from their funders, did not care really at all about the things that are often talked about as, or what I think about as transparency for accountability, financials, names of staff, although that's important, addresses, all the basic kinds of things, audits that you would put on a website and is sort of best practice to put on a website. They didn't care. That was not useful to them. What did they want? Well, they wanted information about two things, really. How did foundations select the nonprofits that they were going to, or organizations, because increasingly foundations are funding more than just nonprofits. How do they select the organizations that were going to get funded and why? Well, that's obvious. There's a self-interest in that. And the other, and I think this is where GuideStar and CEP's work overlaps a lot, is in what they've been learning, right? So grantees really wanted to know, craved this information about what the foundation had assessed, what they tried and was working, and what they tried and importantly hadn't worked. No one wants to recreate the wheel. No one wants to waste those resources. People want to be able to collaborate if somebody else is doing the same thing or trying the same thing. And yet that information, both foundations and grantees viewed it as basically unavailable. And so therein lies this challenge of transparency. The first one, at least, that we'll talk about is, how do you even get the data? How do you produce it? How do you collect it? And how then does it get used by the community? So Jacob, that's where GuideStar comes in, right? You have, what would you say earlier, 2.8 billion pieces of data?
Yep. And so GuideStar was founded 22 years ago with the idea that if we shared information about nonprofits, that people could make better decisions. Now this gets to something that Kevin just said. He said there's transparency for accountability. Be transparent so that we can find the fraudsters, for example. Then there's transparency for decision making. And then there's also transparency for learning, right? And there's sort of this hierarchy we want to build on over time. Maybe we start out with the accountability that then enables us to make better decisions and then enables us to learn. And I think that's actually quite parallel to GuideStar's history. Because 22 years ago, the data source that was available were the tax forms that nonprofits file with the IRS Form 990. And GuideStar faced an interesting strategic question at the beginning of its history, which was, to put it in simple terms, should we go wide and shallow or narrow and deep? Which is to say, would it be better for the field to have really deep information on 1,000 nonprofits or some information on 1 million nonprofits? And our founder, Buzz Schmidt, went around and he asked leaders of the philanthropic sector this question. And the answer came back quite clear, and it was not the one he expected. He expected that the most useful thing would be the really deep information on a handful of organizations so we could really come to understand them. But it turns out sometimes you just need the basic data. And that the first layer, having a first layer that's relatively comprehensive, allows you to then build additional layers on top of that. And so GuideStar spends about $1 million a year hand typing in, and I can talk about this for hours, but hand typing in the data from these documents so that it can be searchable and manipulatable on our website and through our tools, which are used by about 7 million people each year. But as I said before, if we stop with a tax form, we're betraying the complexity and the diversity and the nuance of the nonprofit sector. It would be like if all of us decided, I'm going to tell my story as a human being through my Form 1040. I mean, can you imagine doing that? Like, that doesn't tell your story as a person, right? And nor does a 990 tell the story of nonprofits. But it's a powerful start because it creates a layer that you can build on top of. And so much of the work of transparency is about taking that layer and then learning. It's not about a single act, it's about a process of iterative learning. So we have recently been focusing much of our efforts on gathering additional data directly from you all. Many of you represent nonprofits, directly from the staff of nonprofits, where we're able to ask more meaningful questions like, what are you really trying to accomplish? What's your strategy for achieving the social good that you want to create? What do you believe are the appropriate metrics to track your own progress? So we've now had about 115,000 nonprofits that have shared at least some data with us, with 37,000 getting at least one of what we call our transparency seals that have different layers, bronze, silver, gold, platinum, depending on how much data you provide. And so our hope is that we begin to create a much richer conversation as we have more and more of this data directly from nonprofits, not via the IRS. Isn't it crazy that we as a field have decided to let the IRS be the one who determines how we tell our own story about the work of social good? And I think it's time that we take that back, that we take an active role in articulating the work that we do as a field. So, Kevin, speaking of transparency, can you talk a little bit about those foundations that have chosen to release the results of some of the work that they've done with CEP and what you've learned from that?
Yeah, because it's an interesting story. Jacob says, like, are we letting the IRS tell the story of the nonprofit sector, the social sector more broadly? When you get to the little tier of funders, foundations, especially private foundations, who gets to tell that story? Really, they're accountable to no one, except for their own boards. And so they can tell whatever story they want about themselves. And so it takes this special extra effort to both develop and use and be transparent about the data that would be relevant to them in their own practice as funders. And so when we started out at CEP, one of the things that we heard again and again and again was when we asked people, what data are you collecting and how do you use it as a foundation to assess and improve your performance over time? What we heard again and again was that they were doing surveys of their recipients, and sometimes the people they turned down, although much less frequently, but mostly surveys of recipients. And they were all asking similar questions. How were we in terms of developing a good relationship? Do we have a process that's meaningful and helpful, or is it just a pain in the ass? Do you think that we're having an impact on you or on the fields or communities in which you're working? But no one knew how to interpret that data, because when you hear from a grantee who's received money about the experience of getting that money, it generally sounds pretty good. It's like walking outside today, and if somebody were giving away free ice cream, you probably would not be too concerned about what the brand of that ice cream was. You would just be happy to have an ice cream. Simplification of that story, but that's kind of what it sounded like to hear from grantees directly when a foundation was asking about what it was like to work with them and what they should do better. So CEP came in and created this standardized tool to create a bigger data set that would allow for benchmarking comparison across foundations. So is Hewlett Foundation particularly strong or weak in developing relationships? Does its grantees think that it has more or less impact than other big national foundations? The same questions asked of a local foundation, and so forth. To get a comparative data set, we needed to survey a lot of grantees of a lot of foundations. And so here's where the transparency starts to come into the story. We went to the IRS tax filings of foundations and said, who did you give money to? Whether the foundation wants us to or not, we're going to ask what it was like to work with them. And so we went ahead and did that. People were pissed off. So it gets to an interesting question about transparency. Is it transparency just because you think you have to put some information out there? Or transparency because you actually want people to look at it and use it? In this case, it was pretty clear for some funders that they really didn't want anybody to use that. We got cease and desist letters, legal action saying, you can't ask our grantees a question about us. We're like, well, those aren't your grantees, they're society's nonprofits. We can ask whatever the heck we want. So we created this comparative data set over time that helped people compare, one way or another, how they were doing. And the upshot of that, and Hewlett was the first to do this, which is why it's nice I'm sitting here with Jacob today, is that over time people got more comfortable looking at that data and using it for action and said, well, maybe in terms of both accountability and in opening up channels so that we can get more advice from others, we should make this data public, the data about how we're doing as an organization. So Hewlett took the results of this, what we call the Grantee Perception Report, and put it up on their website. This was back in 2006 or 7. Right around the time Jacob was joining the foundation. That was so unusual and viewed as such an act of transparency that the New York Times wrote a story about it. That a foundation had chosen to make available to the general public some aspect of feedback about their own work, to be transparent about that. And fundamentally, it changed the dynamic of the funding sector. Now,
and not only did they write an article, but the first sentence of the article was, the mighty William and Flora Hewlett Foundation sent a shockwave through the nonprofit sector yesterday.
It was a little hyperbolic.
It was.
It was a little hyperbolic. But it's true that they started a trend. So now we've worked with almost 300 funders to get this kind of feedback from grantees. We have a bigger data set, and something like 50 of them have chosen to make it public, opening up this real conversation, not just with grantees, but across the funding sector, about transparency for learning. Hey, you did this well and we didn't. What can I learn from you? And I think a little bit that is sort of what you're trying to do with GuyStar Platinum.
Yep.
You want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that there are these tiers, and they map to different types of data that a nonprofit might share. So the bronze level is up-to-date operational data. What's your address? What are the names of your programs? Names of your staff. Silver is up-to-date financial data that's fresher than what you would get from the 990, which is often 2 years old. Gold is what we call qualitative programmatic data. So those are sentences where you answer questions like, what's your goal, what's your strategy, how are you going to get there? And then we released Platinum just a few weeks ago, and that's quantitative programmatic data. So that's a number or a set of numbers assigned to a given metric where you talk about the progress that you're making against your metric. Now here's the challenge, and it gets to something that Kevin talked about. The reason why CEP was so successful was that they were asking the same questions to the grantees of different foundations. So the data that came back was comparable. So foundations that had been hearing, oh, I'm a 5 out of 7 and thought they were great, discovered they weren't great because the average was 6 out of 7, which was only possible to discover because there was standardization across the questions. And this question of standardization is absolutely essential to broader questions around transparency and data in the nonprofit sector, because we want to be able to make those comparisons because they're more meaningful and they can be powerful, but we still have to reflect the diversity and the nuance of the nonprofit sector. And a metaphor that I like to use is of a farmer's market. If you think about a farmer's market, it can actually be great when all the farmers have stalls that are the same, because then what you focus on is what should be different, which are the fruits and vegetables, right? So the presence of standardization allows you to see and taste and smell the diversity in a more sort of fluid way. So our challenge in the nonprofit sector is to figure out how do we demonstrate the diversity of the nonprofit sector, but in a sufficiently standardized way that we can actually make meaningful comparisons. So Platinum is structured to try and tread this thin line. We've done research and found 700 metrics used by nonprofits, and we suggest those to nonprofits and hope that they find metrics that are appropriate for them among those 700. But if they don't, we encourage them to add their own, because it is absolutely essential that nonprofits feel a sense of ownership and agency over the metrics they use to measure their own progress. Because if that is imposed from the outside, you won't have that sense of ownership. It won't be embedded in the culture of an organization, and it becomes almost meaningless. So that's one challenge I give to all of you. If you are at a nonprofit, ensure that you know what you're measuring and why you think that's meaningful. And then if you are with a funder, do your very, very best to empower your applicants and grantees to have that sense of ownership over their metrics. So as I said, we just launched this a few weeks ago. We're close to 1,000 nonprofits that have already reached the platinum level. It's been really, really interesting to begin to see the kinds of metrics nonprofits are giving us. Are they short-term versus long-term? Are they activities? What does a nonprofit do? Or are they outcomes? What are the lasting results of that nonprofit's work? Do they just share one or many? Are they part of this common set of 700 that we suggest? Or are they new custom metrics? We're just beginning to get some of the data back to answer these sorts of questions, but I believe that over the next couple of years, you'll begin to see through this mechanism, I hope, the appropriate degree of standardization of the metrics that nonprofits use to track their progress, while still ensuring that nonprofits have that sense of agency.
So, Jacob, I want to ask, like, I filled our platinum profile out for GuideStar. And here I sit, a huge advocate for transparency and comparison and standardization. And in the metrics that I filled out, I took 2 of your 700, and then I couldn't help myself, and I added another one because I thought that it was important to our work and the message about what we were trying to get across. Even in this 1,000 so far, how often do you see folks using the standardized measures versus customized measures? I'm sorry, I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question, because I didn't know I was until about 5 minutes ago.
And the only data I have is so preliminary, I hesitate to even say it, but I will say they're definitely both, but right now it is more on the custom side than on the standardized side. But that's great, that's a lesson, right? And it very well may be that some of the custom metrics are suggested by many nonprofits, which then can become a new part of a common database that we could have never created ourselves. It could only emerge organically when you have the right infrastructure in place. So I'm going to be fascinated. We want to wait until we have a couple thousand nonprofits before we start to do the really deep analysis and say, for example, does it vary by issue area? Are human services nonprofits more likely to use common metrics than advocacy nonprofits? I don't know. That seems like a fair hypothesis, but we'll find out. Wait until later this year and we'll have a better answer to that question.
Can we talk about one other challenge to that kind of information and the kind of information that CEP is collecting? We talk about all this data and we assume that it has inherent value. And to have inherent value, it has to be credible. It has to be meaningful information, right? So one of the pieces of research that CEP did a little while back was to ask nonprofits, how much are you spending on assessment per year in your organization? The median percentage was about 2% of budget, operating budget on assessment. The median size of the organizations were about $1.5 million. So that translates down to something like $50,000 a year or less on any sort of information creation in a systematic way. And I think that one of the challenges that we all have, that we all face, is understanding which of our data is more useful, more credible, and then focusing in on the processes that will reinforce the collection of good data that's useful. How do you, I mean, you're getting all of this information in from thousands and thousands of different nonprofits. How do you think about that struggle? I struggle with it even for our own organization, where we spend a lot more on assessment than 2%. Is the information that you're getting, I mean, no, that's not the right question. How do you guys think at GuideStar about encouraging the creation and collection of credible information?
So, several thoughts here. So, we've looked at the gold level answers with some degree of rigor, the sentence answers. And, to oversimplify, we found that about a quarter of them were kind of crap. Half of them were fine, but kind of boring, and then a quarter of them were really, really good. And that actually felt pretty intuitively right to me from my experience with the nonprofit sector. But the thing is, the only way we as a field are going to learn and get better is if we're actually able to see what others are doing. And right now, that's largely obscure. I will say, when I came to the Hewlett Foundation, I was a big snob about the big brand name nonprofits. The American Heart Association or Goodwill or organizations like Nature Conservancy. I just thought, those are old school, they don't know what they're doing. It turns out that a bunch of those have spent millions of dollars on their assessment programs or their strategies, and in many cases, they're amazing. There's incredible clarity, very strong systems, and yet no one in the field knows this, right? Because there's not a way to share what these big organizations have learned in a systematic way. So, in a family, the younger siblings learn from the older siblings. That doesn't really happen that much in the nonprofit sector, and that is an absolute tragedy. So that's part of why I'm so excited about Platinum, is it's just going to help us have much more efficient conversations to be able to see, that's what you're measuring, that's interesting, that seems dumb, ooh, we should try that, and actually be able to instead of, because I think we very often in the sector, we start over from scratch every time we start talking about measurement and evaluation. Instead of actually moving up a layer and then moving up another layer. And technology and then the right sense of collective identity, I think, can help us get there. So that then gets to a question for you, Kevin, which is, how have you seen this actually matter? How have the results of grantee perception reports or other work that you've done changed practice?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, and one that we care a lot about, because we believe that if we're not changing practice, we should go away. That we're a drain on society's resources. And I think that actually, fundamentally, most nonprofits believe that. And so we've spent a lot of time looking at how folks change and when they don't. So I want to share just two stories. One of them is research that we did about the first set of 100 or so funders that used this grantee feedback tool through CEP, whether or not they made the data public. They used it internally, and they commissioned us to do it. We looked at whether, when we came back and surveyed their grantees again, whether they'd actually changed, statistically changed in grantees' ratings. And we found that they did. And so I don't want to claim causality. I can't. We didn't do a randomized control trial. Even that doesn't always get to causality. But at least it gave us a good sense that the logic that we were using, our theory of change, held true. That presented with good, candid, transparent information, contextualized appropriately, and enhanced with good research that supports what a good practice is and what a not good practice is, that foundations can and will change. And that shows up in changed grantees' experiences with those foundations. So that gave us a lot of hope, and we continue to do that work. The less helpful story, and I think it gets this question of usability. So we've talked about transparency as a principle. We've talked about transparency in terms of getting the actual data. And then there's the last step, which is transparency for learning. Do you use it for something? So these foundations were using this transparent data from grantees. they came to us and they said, well, a group of us, there were about 15 foundations funding in Detroit. They said, we are constantly running into each other. We don't even know what the goals and strategies are of our funding peers, who they're giving in grants to, what those grantees are doing, why the grants were given. CEP, can you help us create a new data set, a data set of who we're giving to, for what reasons, and with what approach? And so we did. We spent a lot of time working with them on creating a grantee list, having them mark up the grantee list and the grant list with strategies and programs and approaches. Is this a policy grant? Is this a research grant? Is this a direct services grant? We pulled it all together. We had this beautiful picture. You could see exactly where you overlapped with other people. It's exactly what the program staff told us they wanted from these foundations. We rolled it out. There were all these aha moments. Oh my God, I didn't know you were doing that. I didn't know you were in this neighborhood. We should work together. And then we waited about a month. And we monitored, because it's an online tool, how often people were logging in and looking at it. Really, really rarely. And so we went back and we talked to folks. Well, why aren't you using this more? This should be a tool that's on your desktop. You're making a grant in Detroit. Who else is working with this grantee on these issues for the same reason as you are? Oh, well, that's just not the thing that's incentivized in our organization. What's incentivized is getting the process done and doing it efficiently. Well, that's depressing. And so we tried another one of these and said, well, maybe it's those funders. So we'll do this for education funders. Made some changes to make it easier, more usable. Same result. And we were done. So I think that that's a more disheartening story and a cautionary note of you can have all the information you want. It can be credible and accurate, and it can be marked up with all the things you said you wanted. Approach, strategy, goals, outcomes. And you still have to change culture and practice within organizations to get it used. And that's where I'm still optimistic, but I think I underestimated that piece of the challenge as CEP entered the fray of creating data for use.
And I'll just say I've had a similarly humbling experience when thinking about how data is used about nonprofits. That, like I said, we have 7 million users, 191 other platforms, including Amazon and the donor-advised funds of Fidelity, Vanguard, and Schwab using GuideStar's data. But they're mostly using it for operational, financial, and legal reasons, which is great. That builds accountability, that builds efficiency. But up until now, they haven't really been using it for deep learning about what works for social change. And I think that's very parallel to the experience that CEP has had. I mean, CEP has transformed how many foundations communicate and interact with their grantees. And let me just emphasize how huge an accomplishment that is, because again, foundations are the least accountable institutions in American society, which is their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. And CEP has helped to transform their behavior. But it's gone this far. So our collective challenge, I think, is to go to that next step of going beyond the operational and the process towards the hard questions of social change. So with that, I think we're going to need to close, Kevin. I just wonder, though, if you could share a few thoughts from the blog post you recently did about the tragedy in Orlando and how our work, which can feel somewhat abstract, relates to the tangible, emotional, experience of those that we're ultimately trying to serve.
Yeah, I don't think my thoughts are. I tried to clarify that as much as I could in this post, which was as much a coping and cathartic mechanism for me as it was meant to be an influencer on other people's practice. But I do think that I sat down on Sunday morning and was thinking to myself, God, I sit in this infrastructure organization helping foundations that help grantees, that help beneficiaries, and yet this stuff is still happening. So does my work matter? Does our work in trying to create more data, more transparency, more useful information matter? And I started to think about the intractable set of problems that Orlando represented, right? Homophobia, Islamophobia, broken gun laws, a dysfunctional democratic process that is challenged in fixing those things. And then I started Googling. And then I went to GuideStar, actually, and started looking, who's working on this stuff? And as you start to think about the way those problems are layered together and how difficult they seem, it just came to me that all of this work that we're doing, all of us in this room, is important. Because inevitably, if we pull the string of our work, I bet it gets back to Orlando somehow. we might be further up the chain or lower down, closer to the beneficiary's work. But unless we know what other people are doing, who else is working on these problems, then what we have are a bunch of individual attempts and not the sense of, I think, community and momentum and shared effort that, it sounds so wonky to say it, but that I really do believe that sharing information about what works and what doesn't, sharing information about what our organizations are doing and what they're not, that all of that matters, because fundamentally it creates the sometimes feeling abstract ability to make a change and do our work better. But that fundamentally it's also about giving voice to the fact that we are a community together working to solve really hard problems. And that as a community together, all of that information about what we're doing is really a profound statement of optimism about our ability to improve. That's probably a little incoherent, but
I love it. I think that, as you said, the tragedy in Orlando is so illustrative of how the challenges we face are profoundly intertwined, a Gordian knot of challenges. And I think if we're going to try and untie that or cut through it, we've got to figure out what's going on. And we've got to understand what our allies are doing and have feedback loops to help us all learn and get better. That's the only way that we as a collective community of people trying to make the world better are going to make the kind of progress that I think we all dream of. So with that, should we hand it off to the audience for Q&A?
Some questions.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, we'll take question and answers for about 20 minutes. I have one here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Leticia. Thank you guys for being here. I have two questions, so bear with me. What responsibility do you guys feel that you have in teaching individual donors, on how to kind of review, interpret, and make decisions on the nonprofits that they're looking at on your sites? And are you or do you have plans to kind of help donors to identify and compare perhaps how nonprofits that they're interested in are kind of working on similar causes, actively kind of helping donors if they're looking for causes revolving around hunger or eye care, health issues, where they can kind of follow and compare those organizations on an ongoing basis? So thank you.
Why don't I take this one to start, since GuideStar does more work with individual donors, although you may have thoughts on how this plays out with foundation donors. And so we at GuideStar see ourselves as having a profound responsibility to organize the data, and then to let people bring what questions are appropriate to that data, and to make that as easy as possible. And then we have a responsibility to think about how we're presenting the data to make sure that that's actually aligned with good decision making. So for example, I talked about the overhead ratio, a bad way of thinking about nonprofit performance that's quite destructive. We used to have a little pie chart on a page for a given nonprofit where we shared the overhead ratio. We took that off. We don't even share the overhead ratio anymore. So we are making choices. We can say, well, we're totally objective and neutral, but still the choices that we make in how to present the data, they embed our opinions about what matters. We've tried to go one step beyond that and have a proactive campaign targeted at donors that says, hey donors, look, overhead is not what matters. What matters is results, and you need to pay attention to that and give nonprofits more flexibility to invest in themselves in a way that they see as appropriate. And we wrote a letter which we got signed by kind of our competitors, Charity Navigator and Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, who are only sort of our competitors actually, because they're actually doing ratings, whereas GuideStar is not doing a rating. We're sharing information. The bronze, silver, gold, platinum is not a rating per se, it's just an indication of a level of transparency. But we got these colleague organizations to co-sign this letter with us, which we put under a Creative Commons license, which means that any of you in the audience can post it on your website, can print out as many copies as you want, can share them with nonprofits. The thing is that there's a shared sense of responsibility here. We can do something, but there are others who have to act as well if we're going to move donors to a better place. And nonprofits are perhaps the most important actor. We did one back of the envelope calculation that about 1 billion times a year, nonprofits send out a letter to donors asking for money that prominently displays that nonprofit's overhead ratio. right? So the nonprofit sector has trained donors to pay attention to the wrong thing. So I would ask all of you, take those off and share data that's meaningful about your work. So there are some things that we can do that can begin to push donors in a more productive direction. In the end, philanthropy is still going to be fundamentally a relationship game. It's going to be deeply emotional. But we can begin to infuse more meaningful information into that. And I think we can do that without taking the heart out of philanthropy. And actually, I think that meaningful information can get donors more engaged. And so it's going to be a long journey, but I think we're making some progress.
And this is on, yes. So, Jacob, you'd mentioned that GuideStar has 700 standardized metrics that you can choose from. And earlier, and maybe it was last night, we heard about Classy launching their Progress platform that also has some standardized ways to talk about the impact. It sounds like the approach is trying to give the opportunity to have some standardized metrics and then some that show differentiation and unique things about the nonprofits. How are you guys working together, at least perhaps on the standardized portion?
Yeah. So we have a meeting at 3:30 this afternoon with them to talk about this, among other questions. For data standards to be powerful, you need multiple organizations using the same standard, right? And a great example is the VIN number that a car has allows Carfax and Cars.com and others to know that we're talking about the same car. And so there are a number of efforts in the nonprofit sector to create these data standards that aren't necessarily only used by one organization, but allow for data to be shared across organizations. There's something called the Bridge ID, which is a unique identifier for nonprofits all around the world that was launched by GuideStar Foundation Center, TechSoup, and Global Giving. There's a new taxonomy created by the Foundation Center called the Philanthropy Classification System. The questions that we ask on GuideStar are becoming a de facto standard of how a nonprofit describes its work. So we've got some work to do to establish some of those things. We have not yet figured out a true standard of what the list of metrics is. We hope that what we call those 700 metrics, our common results catalog, I hope that could become a standard that Progress and GuideStar and Charity Navigator and Foundation Center are all drawing from. We've got some work to do on that. There's some governance challenges around that. If you're going to have something that's used by multiple organizations, who has the right to change it? And who is responsible for keeping it up to date? And if you're going to have an API that would allow a programmer to pull from that, who has to maintain that? So there's some questions, but the answer is yes, I hope so, but we're not quite there.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I think that your question was a little bit about the supply side. Who is creating, or the infrastructure side, who's creating the infrastructure for this sharing of common data? And I think then you can also think about that question from the demand side. Who's demanding, common data? And Jacob talked about the need for individuals to start changing their own thought process and behavior to kind of demand information that's credible and easily accessible and hopefully more common. There was an interesting article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, probably the one that's floating around, about who will pay for this data. And the author, I think his name is Rick Jacobus, was making the argument that it has to be fundamentally nonprofits and other social enterprises use the data, but funders, whether they're individuals or organizations, will need to pay for that data. And he almost implied that nonprofits need to kind of just build it in, fake it in to the cost of it into their efforts so that it can create this growing infrastructure. But I'd argue that there's also a direct funder, organizational, institutional funder priority to force fit this a little bit, force nonprofits and social enterprises into systems, and I think the best one is GuideStar's system, to share that information and then all of them draw from the same place. Now there have been dozens of attempts from the funding community to try to funnel people into shared metrics. Most of them have failed under their own weight, or under the weight of individual organizations wanting something very specific that they believe no one else wants. And so that gets back to this question of culture and practice and understanding that you might not get the perfect thing, but my God, comparative, common metrics is a lot more powerful than something that's perfect but stands on its own.
There's this question of to what degree are we unique snowflakes, all perfectly different, uncomparable to others. And I think our challenge in the field is to say there are some things that are common, and then there are some things that are unique. But we've got to get that balance right.
Hi, my name is Jane Walsh, and I'm curious on your opinions around the need for more unrestricted general operating support. And specifically, if you believe that there's a need for it, what are your organizations doing that on the supply side to promote it, as well as track it, to be able to ideally show that organizations that get more gen ops are actually more effective in leading to bigger outcomes?
Can I start with this one?
Please.
You've put your finger right on something I think that is not only important now, it's been important for a long time, and we still struggle with it in our sector. So my vantage point is big foundations. And by big, I don't mean huge. I mean those giving away usually more than $3 million a year. So that's not huge. But they're bigger than an individual donor. And Jacob can talk about individual donations. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of responses from grantees about what kind of support they received and what impact it had on them. What was really interesting, this is one of the first questions that we were asked about by foundations. How important is it that we give general operating support? We said, well, theoretically, it's kind of important, but let's look at the data. What was really interesting was that actually the grantees' experience and their comments and ratings about what effect that grant had on them was no different between program support and general operating support until you got to a grant that was about $100,000 and for more than 1 year. And then it started to make a really outsized difference in the impact on their organization and the sustainability of the work that was being funded. And so the responsibility that we feel at CEP is not just to argue for general operating support, but actually argue for general operating support done well, at meaningful contribution levels and over time. And that is the thing that will accelerate an organization's ability to grow and achieve, and not just a $20,000 one-time, one-year general operating support grant, because that is frankly fungible. A nonprofit is going to go in and treat it the same way as a program support grant.
And I'll just add, I think also this is another case where there's shared responsibility, and that nonprofits have a role in this as well, which is if nonprofits are only sharing information, which is a couple of anecdotes and then some financial data about their organization as a whole, and then focusing all of their rhetoric and pitches on one particular project, similarly, you're reinforcing the old structure where foundations and donors are going to think in terms of projects. And so as nonprofits do a better job of articulating their organization as an enterprise through all of its complexity, the impact that it creates as a whole, we start to begin, I hope, to shift the conversation towards more general operating support. In terms of your question about tracking it, our colleagues at the Foundation Center are best positioned to track that. They have the best data on grants.
Although there's not much evidence that it's increasing.
That is true, yeah.
Not much evidence it's increasing.
It's nudged up a tiny bit.
And I want to nudge you a little bit because I think your answer about what nonprofits need to do was spoken a little bit like an ex-program officer at a foundation.
Okay, good.
Because I think that nonprofits have to be asked. Right? I agree that there's some culpability, if we want to put guilt terms on it, right, about what you're asking for as a nonprofit. But in the moment of finally getting that conversation with a program officer at a foundation that can make a real difference to you, if all you're asked about is what do you know right now, or what do you know about this program, then I think foundations are just as sort of culpable in not raising the question, what do you need for your organization? What are the challenges that you're facing? And what data might you have that you haven't told me about the operations of your work more broadly?
I think that's right. Other questions?
Hi, thank you. Chris Pesnick with Project Concern International. I liked your comment that you're de-emphasizing overhead because I think that's a little fungible in terms of how you interpret it. And at the same time, I do value as a nonprofit, and I presume a funder would as well, this idea of value for money.
Yep.
What for every dollar invested, what kind of impact are you having? How have you looked at that particular issue in GuideStar in your sort of classification and vetting?
Yeah, good, great question. And I will say, I personally believe that overhead is useful for one purpose, which is filtering out the fraudsters, who are a tiny, tiny fraction of the sector, but there are some scoundrels out there, right? But what the problem is, we've taken a tool that you should use to filter out the bad and used it to determine who's the best, right? It's like using the mechanisms for a health safety inspection of a restaurant to decide which restaurant has the most delicious food, right? It's just like the wrong framework to use. But I mean, questions of efficiency matter. Questions of value for money matter. As we get more and more of the platinum data, we're going to begin to be able to, we're going to have the opportunity to start doing some pretty simple math and saying, oh, you led an extra 30 people to graduate and you're a $300,000 a year organization. Therefore, that's $10,000 per graduate. The challenge with that is that different organizations are working with very different populations. And you think about 2 homeless shelters. One thing a homeless shelter might measure is average number of nights stay at a given homeless shelter. But if you've got one homeless shelter that is serving the newly homeless who maybe just missed one rent payment, and then another one that's mostly serving the chronically homeless that are dealing with profound challenges of mental illness or drug addiction, the way you think about a metric like number of average nights per stay should be profoundly different, right? So we want to make sure that we're offering rich data that allows us to have conversations about, oh, what you're doing is more efficient, without oversimplifying. And so that's really hard. But I think donors can drive towards questions of efficiency and value per dollar, but they should not expect perfect answers because the work of nonprofits is too messy. But nonprofits need to share enough information to be able to show that complexity and demonstrate efficiency, even as they're saying, but here's why it's not a perfect comparison.
I was talking to a foundation yesterday and about almost this exact challenge, because I think it's an important one. And she was saying, oh, we're reaching our 5th anniversary. They're a relatively new foundation, and we just had this evaluation commission, and the thing that came out of it, and I'm so proud of this, is that we touched 25,000 beneficiaries' lives. And I just about lost whatever hair I had left, because it was like, that is not the right question. Touched how? Why? Who were they before? Who are they now? Like hanging your hat as a funder on something as simplistic as an output of lives touched. Did you give them a lollipop? Or did you actually fundamentally change the course of their lives? And what's your goal? And so I do think that the conversation on both sides, grantees, nonprofits, and funders, needs to be nuanced and really attentive to outputs in what context, and then jargony, but outcomes in what context. And how do we judge that, and why does it matter?
And I just, we can get the data of, yes, this foundation funded 25,000 lollipops, and let's just say that, and that's cool. Maybe you think lollipops are important. I like lollipops. And then, this organization used the same amount of money to utterly transform 250 people's lives.
Right.
Let's then have a conversation about what is the better thing to do.
True that.
So we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. I think you had your hand up.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Melissa Gopnik. I'm with Doorways to Dreams. We do financial inclusion work. And one of the things as an innovation lab is we fail a lot, right? That's part of being innovative is failing. And so how, from a grant making, when we have to write these grants that says we're going to do all these wonderful things, and then they fail, what are your thoughts on how we deal with that complexity?
Yeah, and I put the burden of some of this on the funder community themselves for being open to and asking those questions. And when they say the words, what did you learn? Which is really kind of what didn't go well, they really need to mean what did you learn? So when we did some research on transparency, the thing that foundation CEOs said that they needed to do better, the thing they said that they needed to most do better was to share failing among themselves, both to learn from each other, but also to model that, and to model that it's okay. So then we asked them, why don't you do it? And they said the biggest reason was we don't have time, 31%. Okay, so that's a question of prioritization. The second reason that they gave was it's hard to be consistent in how we talk about failure. Well, that's a problem of diction and culture and practice within an organization. And the third, I think, was our board doesn't want us to share anything. And so I looked at those reasons and thought to myself, well, you guys have a long way to go to make true what you say you want, which is that it should be open and okay to talk about failure, because you can't find the time to do it in your own organization. You can't create the culture that allows it in your organization. You haven't convinced your board that it's important. So I think that there's a long way to go. I think it's an important topic. I think it is the key so that we don't reinvent the wheel and waste resources, right? But I don't have a silver bullet answer other than to say we have a lot of work on both sides to do.
And this, I think, is a classic case where there are some promising signs. I mean, there are a lot of foundation leaders that will talk a big game about failure and about learning. That's a good start, right? So let's lead to some cognitive dissonance in their minds as they realize that some of their practices may not match what they're saying. And then let's be sure that all of us are doing the same thing, that we're willing to be honest, that we're sharing information to enable learning, that we're absorbing what others are learning, so we can all get better together.
Because that's our goal.
That's our goal.
That's our goal.